Nebraska Territory, 1878. A land of endless horizons and unforgiving seasons, where men and women carved their existence from stubborn soil and even more stubborn dreams. For the men who settled these vast plains, finding a wife often meant placing advertisements in Eastern newspapers, seeking women hardy enough to endure the challenges of frontier life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what happens when the bride who arrives brings skills for parlors rather than prairies? This is the story of Charlotte Hayes, a Boston bookkeeper whose refined manners and education led 3 potential husbands to send her back east before she could even unpack her trunks. A woman deemed too delicate for frontier life, until she met Nathan Caldwell, a wheat farmer whose calloused hands matched the hardness in his eyes. In the harshest drought the territory had seen in decades, these 2 outcasts would discover that sometimes the most valuable skills aren't written in a farmer's almanac, and that true strength can be found in the most unexpected places, even in the heart of a city-bred mail-order bride. Charlotte Hayes stood on the train platform in Cedar Ridge, Nebraska Territory, clutching her handkerchief against the swirling dust that assaulted her lungs. The tiny frontier settlement looked nothing like the bustling streets of Boston she had left behind. Where Boston had cobblestone and brick, Cedar Ridge had dirt and weathered wood. Where Boston had order, Cedar Ridge seemed scattered by the prairie wind. Buildings dropped haphazardly across the landscape. At 28, Charlotte was well past the age when most women in Boston society had secured husbands and started families. Not that she hadn't had opportunities. There had been several interested parties over the years, but Charlotte had been consumed with caring for her ailing father after her mother's passing, and then with keeping his bookkeeping business afloat after he, too, succumbed to consumption. When the business finally failed, crushed under the weight of competitors with newer methods and younger apprentices, Charlotte faced the stark reality of her situation, unmarried, with dwindling funds and no family connections to speak of. The advertisement in the Boston Herald had seemed like divine providence. Respectable farmer seeks educated woman of good. Character for marriage. Must appreciate honest work and the rewards of rural life. Passage paid. After an exchange of letters that had spanned 3 months, Charlotte had agreed to marry Jim Prescott, a shopkeeper in Cedar Ridge, who had described his establishment as the center of commerce in a growing community. The letters had been cordial, even warm at times, painting a picture of a civilized life on the frontier. Standing now in the whirling dust, Charlotte wondered if those letters had described an entirely different place. Miss Hayes. A tall man approached, fingering the brim of his hat nervously. He was older than she expected, with a face weathered by sun and wind, and a mustache that drooped at the corners like his apparent spirits. This was Jim Prescott, the man whose carefully penned letters had convinced her to travel halfway across the country. "Mr. Prescott," Charlotte said, extending her gloved hand. Even this small gesture of Eastern politeness seemed to confuse him, and he hesitated before taking her hand in a brief, awkward grasp. "The journey from Omaha wasn't too difficult, I hope?" he asked, eyeing her travel dress with its fashionable bustle and lace collar. "The accommodations were rustic but serviceable," Charlotte replied diplomatically, omitting the bone-jarring discomfort of the stagecoach and the questionable lodgings along the way. Jim cleared his throat. "Well, I've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house. We can be married by Pastor Thomas tomorrow, if that suits." "I would prefer to have a few days to settle in, Mr. Prescott," Charlotte said firmly. "Getting to know one another before we enter into matrimony seems only sensible." Jim blinked rapidly at her direct manner. Of course, very sensible." Their walk to the boarding house revealed the true nature of Cedar Ridge. The growing community Jim had described consisted of a dusty main street with a handful of buildings: his general store, a blacksmith, a small church, the boarding house, and what appeared to be a saloon at the far end of town. Beyond that lay scattered farms, stretching into the endless prairie. Charlotte asked pointed questions about the store's inventory, accounting practices, and customer base. Topics that seemed to fluster Jim rather than impress him. "You seem to have quite the head for business, Miss Hayes," he finally commented as they reached the boarding house steps. "My father was a bookkeeper in Boston. He believed daughters should be educated in practical matters." She smiled, remembering her father's patient lessons at the desk where they had worked side by side for years. "How dead progressive," Jim replied in a tone that suggested this wasn't necessarily a compliment. "Well, Mrs. Wilson runs a respectable establishment here. I'll call on you tomorrow, shall I?" The boarding house was clean, if sparse. Mrs. Wilson, a widow with sharp eyes and a perpetual frown, seemed both curious and skeptical about Charlotte's trunk full of books and her modest but decidedly Eastern wardrobe. "Books won't keep you warm or fed out here, Miss Hayes," she remarked as Charlotte unpacked. "Men in these parts need wives who can work from sun-up to sundown, not read poetry." "I assure you, Mrs. Wilson, I'm not afraid of hard work," Charlotte replied, though she wondered if her definition of work, keeping ledgers, writing correspondence, managing household accounts, aligned with the frontier's expectations. From her window, Charlotte observed Cedar Ridge as dusk settled over the prairie. The vast emptiness surrounding the tiny settlement was both terrifying and oddly compelling. She had come west, seeking security and a fresh start. Now she would need to prove that her city skills could translate to this raw, unforgiving landscape. Jim Prescott called upon her the next day as promised, taking her on a tour of his general store. The establishment was smaller than Charlotte had envisioned from his letters, with a haphazard arrangement of goods and a ledger system that made her fingers itch to reorganize it. "If you implemented a proper inventory system and organized your shelving by category, you could serve customers more efficiently," she suggested, already mentally rearranging the cluttered shop. "And your ledger could benefit from double entry. Bookkeeping. I noticed several calculation errors just glancing at the current page." Jim's smile grew strained. "I've managed just fine these 12 years, Miss Hayes. Most ladies find the fabric section more interesting than my account books." Charlotte dutifully examined the bolts of calico and gingham, but couldn't help adding, "Your fabric selection is limited. Have you considered stocking heavier materials for work clothes? The calico is lovely, but surely the farmers and ranchers need sturdy canvas and wool." That evening, Charlotte dined alone at the boarding house, aware of curious glances from the other residents. Mrs. Wilson eventually sat across from her, pouring them both tea without asking. "Mr. Prescott seemed a bit flustered when he dropped you off earlier," she remarked, her tone conversational, but her eyes shrewd. Charlotte sighed. "I may have overwhelmed him with suggestions for his business. Jim Prescott has been running that store the same way since he took it over from his father," Mrs. Wilson said flatly. "Men like that don't appreciate innovation, especially from a woman." "Especially from a city woman," Charlotte finished. "Yes, I'm familiar with the sentiment." Mrs. Wilson's perpetual frown softened slightly. "This territory needs strong women, Miss Hayes, but it also needs women who understand its ways. Don't let anyone tell you your education isn't valuable, but perhaps consider how you present your ideas." Charlotte considered this advice as she sipped her tea. She had never been particularly skilled at tempering her intelligence or playing the demure maiden. Her father had valued her sharp mind and straight-talking nature. Perhaps she should try harder with Jim. After all, her options were limited. The next 3 days passed in a similar fashion. Charlotte attempted to show interest in the aspects of mercantile life that Jim deemed appropriate for a wife, arranging displays, welcoming customers with a smile, pouring coffee for the men who gathered to exchange news. But inevitably, her true nature would emerge. She reorganized an entire shelf while Jim was occupied with a customer. She corrected his arithmetic when he miscalculated a sale. She discussed the latest agricultural techniques with a group of farmers, displaying far more knowledge than Jim himself possessed. On the fourth day, Charlotte arrived at the store to find Jim unusually solemn. "Miss Hayes," he began, ushering her into the small office behind the counter, "I've given our arrangement considerable thought." Charlotte already knew what would follow. She had seen the discomfort in his eyes grow with each passing day. "I believe we may not be as compatible as our correspondence suggested," he continued. "You are an impressive woman, certainly, but I fear you would not be content with the life I can offer." "You mean I am not the biddable wife you envisioned?" Charlotte replied, no bitterness in her tone, merely stating a fact. Jim had the grace to look embarrassed. "You deserve someone who can appreciate your unique qualities. I've taken the liberty of informing Robert Anderson of your situation. He owns the lumber mill outside of town and has been seeking a wife. Perhaps you would be better matched." And so, for the price of a new stagecoach ticket and a sincere apology, Jim Prescott dissolved their agreement. Charlotte found herself redirected to Robert Anderson's substantial home at the edge of town, where the elderly housekeeper who kept his house eyed her with thinly veiled suspicion. Robert Anderson proved to be everything Jim Prescott was not: tall, confident, and commanding. His lumber mill was the largest employer in the region, and he ran it with ruthless efficiency. Initially, Charlotte found his decisive nature refreshing after Jim's uncertainty. "I need a wife who understands business," he told her bluntly during their first dinner together. "Someone who can handle the social obligations that come with my position while I focus on expansion. Your background seems well suited." Charlotte allowed herself a flicker of hope. "I would welcome involvement in business matters. My father always said I had a natural aptitude." Robert's expression cooled slightly. "Involvement? No, Miss Hayes. I meant understanding why my business must come first. A wife's duty is to create a peaceful home and represent the family well in society. I have foremen and managers for business concerns." The following days revealed the vast gulf between Robert's expectations and Charlotte's nature. He appreciated her intellect in theory, but became irritated when she questioned his methods after observing operations at the mill. When she suggested improvements to the cutting line that could reduce waste, his expression darkened. "My men won't take instruction from a woman, Miss Hayes. It undermines my authority. But if the suggestion has merit is irrelevant. Perception is everything in business." The final break came when Charlotte, genuinely trying to be helpful, reorganized Robert's office during his absence, implementing a filing system that would allow him to locate contracts and correspondence more efficiently. Robert returned to find his papers in unfamiliar places and Charlotte proudly explaining her system. His face flushed with anger. "This is exactly what I feared. You overstep your bounds at every turn. A wife should complement her husband, not compete with him." 2 weeks after arriving in Cedar Ridge, Charlotte found herself, once again, at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, this time with an invitation to meet Edmund Clark, the town banker. Mrs. Wilson's expression was sympathetic as she welcomed Charlotte. "Mr. Anderson found me too assertive," Charlotte explained, unpacking her trunk for the second time. "Assertive is one way to put it," Mrs. Wilson replied with a small smile, though he used considerably less flattering terms at the barber shop yesterday. Edmund Clark was a widower of 43 with thinning hair and meticulous habits. Where Jim had been intimidated and Robert angered by Charlotte's forthright nature, Edmund seemed merely amused. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "You've caused quite the stir in our little community, Miss Hayes," he remarked over tea in his well-appointed parlour. "2 potential husbands in less than a month. That might be a record for Cedar Ridge." Charlotte appreciated his humour but remained cautious. "I find that being honest about who I am from the beginning avoids disappointment later. A commendable philosophy. I value honesty myself. My late wife, God rest her soul, was a gentle, nurturing woman. After 6 years alone, I find I miss female companionship, but I have no illusions about finding another like Margaret." This pragmatic approach appealed to Charlotte. Perhaps a man who had already experienced a loving marriage would be more accepting of a different kind of partnership. Edmund was undeniably intelligent and cultured by frontier standards. His home contained more books than Charlotte had seen since leaving Boston, and he engaged her in stimulating conversation about literature and current events. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and didn't flinch when she disagreed with him. For the first time since arriving in Nebraska, Charlotte allowed herself to believe she might have found a suitable match. Edmund didn't need her to pretend to be something she wasn't. His established position meant he had nothing to prove, unlike Jim with his struggling business, or Robert with his empire-building ambitions. Their courtship proceeded smoothly for nearly 2 weeks. Edmund introduced Charlotte to the respectable families of Cedar Ridge, proudly showcasing her knowledge and wit. Charlotte began to envision a life as Mrs. Clark, managing his household, reading by the fire on winter evenings, perhaps even assisting with some of the bank's correspondence. Then came the dinner party at Judge Harrison's home, where the conversation turned to the territorial governor's recent policies regarding land claims and water rights. Charlotte, who had thoroughly studied these issues before leaving Boston, offered her analysis of how the new regulations might affect small farmers. The table fell silent. Edmund's smile remained fixed, but something in his eyes hardened. Later, as they walked back to the boarding house, his manner was noticeably cooler. "You made quite an impression tonight," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The water rights issue is fascinating from a legal perspective," Charlotte replied. "Judge Harrison seemed interested in my observations." "Yes, well," Edmund cleared his throat, "in the future, perhaps it would be best to let the men handle political discussions. A woman with too many opinions on such matters can make people uncomfortable." Charlotte stopped walking. "Are you uncomfortable with my opinions, Mr. Clark?" Edmund sighed. "I admire your intelligence, Miss Hayes, truly. But there's a difference between private intellectual discourse and public display. A banker's wife must be above reproach in all things, including knowing when to speak and when to smile politely, even when the smile conceals valuable insight." "Especially then," Edmund replied, not unkindly. "The world has certain expectations. Miss Hayes, fighting them at every turn only leads to unhappiness." 3 days later, Edmund Clark regretfully informed Charlotte that he didn't believe their temperaments were well suited for marriage after all. Unlike her previous rejections, he offered no alternative suitor, merely a month's lodging at the boarding house paid in advance to give her time to consider her options. The news spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. 3 men had found Charlotte Hayes too refined, too opinionated, too unsuited for frontier life. Mrs. Wilson found her sitting alone on the boarding house porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the endless prairie in hues of gold and crimson. "I've received a letter," Mrs. Wilson said, without preamble, settling into the chair beside Charlotte. "From Nathan Caldwell. He owns the Broken Wheel Farm about 15 miles north of here. His foreman was in town last week and heard about your situation." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Is Mr. Caldwell looking for entertainment? The tale of the unwanted mail-order bride must provide quite the amusement." "Nathan Caldwell isn't a man who finds amusement in much these days," Mrs. Wilson replied soberly. "He lost his wife and daughter to fever 3 years ago. Hasn't spoken more than 10 words at a time since then, from what I hear." "How tragic," Charlotte murmured, her irritation fading. "He's a hard man, yes, and more comfortable with his crops than people since the tragedy. But fair. He needs a wife, not for company or society, but because his brother, who's been keeping house for him, is returning east to care for their ailing mother." Charlotte felt a flicker of indignation. "And he thinks I'm desperate enough to accept any offer?" Mrs. Wilson's steady gaze held no judgment. "He thinks a woman who speaks her mind might prefer straight talk to pretty words. He offers a marriage of convenience, room and board in exchange for running his household. No false expectations on either side. That's unusually honest. That's Nathan Caldwell. He has no patience for pretense anymore." Mrs. Wilson handed her the letter. "Read it yourself. He'll send a wagon at the end of the week if you're interested. If not, no hard feelings." Later that night, Charlotte read the brief, blunt letter by lamplight. The handwriting was strong but uneven, as if written by someone unused to correspondence. There were no flowery promises or romantic overtures, just straightforward terms and a simple statement: "I don't care about your past or what the town thinks. I need someone who can handle themselves and isn't afraid of hard work or hard truths." As the wind howled across the prairie outside her window, rattling the glass panes like a warning, Charlotte Hayes considered her dwindling options: return east in defeat, seek employment in a town where her reputation was already established, as difficult and unmanageable, or accept this final offer from a grieving, solitary farmer who, at the very least, seemed to value the very qualities others found so objectionable. By morning, Charlotte Hayes had made her decision. She would meet Nathan Caldwell and see for herself if a grief-hardened farmer and a city-bred bookkeeper might forge something honest from the ruins of their expectations. The wagon that arrived for Charlotte at week's end was sturdy but weathered, much like the man who drove it. Matthew Jenkins, the foreman of the Broken Wheel Farm, was a taciturn man in his 50s with sun-creased eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Miss Hayes," he tipped his hat but didn't dismount. "Got room for one trunk, and whatever else you can fit in that space there." He gestured to a small area behind the seat. "Weather's turning. Best we get moving before the dust kicks up worse." The sky hung heavy with heat, confirming his assessment. Charlotte had packed her belongings with efficiency, prioritizing her books and practical clothing over the few frivolous items she'd brought from Boston. Mrs. Wilson pressed a small package into her hands as they said their goodbyes. "Vegetable seeds," she explained. "For starting a kitchen garden, a woman should have something of her own growing, especially out there." The journey to the Broken Wheel stretched from hours into a day as the summer heat intensified, forcing them to travel at a measured pace. Matthew was a man of few words, answering Charlotte's questions with brief, factual responses that offered little insight into what awaited her. "What kind of man is Mr. Caldwell?" she finally asked directly as they crested a hill that revealed a vast golden landscape of wheat fields stretching toward the horizon. Matthew considered this for a long moment. "Fair. Expects hard work because he works harder than anyone. Doesn't suffer fools." He glanced at her. "Doesn't talk much since the fever took his family." Mrs. Wilson mentioned he lost his wife and daughter, Sarah and little Emma. Matthew nodded solemnly. 3 summers ago. Changed him, not just inside. As the wagon descended into the valley, Charlotte caught her first glimpse of the Broken Wheel Farm. Unlike the modest homesteads they'd passed along the way, this was a substantial operation. Hundreds of acres of wheat rippling in the hot wind, a sturdy main house, several outbuildings, and what appeared to be innovative irrigation, channels running between fields. Mr. Caldwell plants wheat varieties from back east that others said wouldn't grow here, Matthew volunteered, following her gaze. Started with just 40 acres after the war. Built it all himself. The main house was constructed of solid timber, 2 stories with a deep porch that wrapped around the front. No smoke rose from the chimney in the summer heat, but a windmill turned steadily nearby, pumping water into a large tank. As Matthew brought the wagon to a halt, the front door opened, spilling midday sunlight across the porch. The man who emerged was lean and angular, dressed in work clothes faded from washing. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone accustomed to physical labor, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Miss Hayes," his voice was gruff from disuse. "Nathan Caldwell, welcome to Broken Wheel." Charlotte hadn't known what to expect, but it wasn't this. Nathan Caldwell appeared to be in his late 30s, though the lines etched around his eyes, and the permanent furrow between his brows suggested he'd lived through more than his years would indicate. His face was deeply tanned from fieldwork, with a jagged scar running from his right temple to his jawline, not from the fever that took his family, she realized, but from some earlier hardship. He made no move to take her hand, instead gesturing toward the house. "Peter's made dinner. You must be hungry after the journey." Inside, the house was plain but well built, with sturdy furniture and ample windows that captured the prairie light. Unlike the cluttered interiors she'd seen in town, everything here had a purpose and a place. The kitchen was spacious and surprisingly well equipped, evidence of careful planning rather than haphazard acquisition. A young man looked up from the stove as they entered. The family resemblance was clear, despite Peter Caldwell being several years younger than his brother, with fewer lines on his face and a more open expression. "Miss Hayes, welcome to the Broken Wheel. I hope Matthew didn't talk your ear off during the ride." His teasing glance at the taciturn foreman suggested this was a long-standing joke between them. "Mr. Jenkins was most informative," Charlotte replied diplomatically, earning a rare hint of amusement in Matthew's eyes. "Matthew says the creek's running low again," Nathan stated, shifting the conversation as he washed his hands at the pump sink. "Down another 3 inches since yesterday," Matthew confirmed. "The north field's starting to show stress." "We'll open the reservoir channel at dawn," Nathan decided, his tone making it clear the matter was settled. Peter served a simple but substantial meal of cornbread, beans, and salt pork. Charlotte noticed that despite the obvious signs of bachelor living, the kitchen was organized with surprising efficiency. Tin recipe boxes sat alongside logbooks on a shelf, suggesting that even cooking here was approached with methodical planning. "Matthew tells me you've had a challenging introduction to our region," Peter said conversationally as they ate. Charlotte met Nathan's eyes across the table, finding not judgment, but assessment in his steady gaze. "I've had the opportunity to learn what I'm not suited for," she replied evenly. "Perhaps now I can discover what I am." Something flickered in Nathan's expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. "Why did the others send you back?" The blunt question might have offended Charlotte weeks ago. Now she found his forthrightness refreshing. "I spoke my mind too readily, made suggestions about their businesses, failed to conform to their expectations of a proper wife." Nathan nodded, as if this confirmed something. "And what are your expectations?" "Miss Hayes, every bargain has 2 sides," Charlotte considered carefully. "Respect, not flattery or false courtesy, but basic respect for my intelligence and capability. I don't require affection, but I won't be treated as property or an ornament." "Fair terms." Nathan set down his fork. "Here's what I offer: a marriage in name with separate rooms. You'll manage the household, which includes cooking, cleaning, preserving the harvest, and keeping accounts. During critical seasons, everyone works where needed: kitchen garden, fields, repairs. You'll have a monthly allowance for personal needs, use of the library, such as it is, and my name for whatever protection that provides." Peter watched this exchange with evident discomfort. "Nathan," he interjected gently, "perhaps Miss Hayes would like time to rest before making decisions." "You're leaving in 5 days," Nathan replied matter-of-factly. "Time is a luxury we don't have." That night, in the neat guest room Peter had prepared, Charlotte sat by the window, watching heat lightning flicker silently on the horizon. The honesty of Nathan Caldwell's proposal resonated with her practical nature. No false promises or romantic illusions, just straightforward terms for a partnership of convenience. After the disappointments in Cedar Ridge, such clarity was almost a relief. Yet questions lingered. What kind of life would she build in this remote place with a man so marked by tragedy? Could two people wounded in different ways, she by society's constraints, he by devastating loss, forge something worthwhile from necessity? Morning brought no rain despite the night's lightning and the realization that decisions couldn't be postponed. Over breakfast, Charlotte announced her acceptance of Nathan's terms. If he felt either satisfaction or misgiving, his weathered features revealed nothing. "Reverend Taylor can't reach us until harvest is done," he said. "We'll need to formalize things then. In the meantime, Peter will show you the household operations." The next several days passed in a flurry of activity as Peter transferred his knowledge of running the Broken Wheel household. Charlotte discovered the farm was nearly self-sufficient by necessity. They smoked their own meat, preserved fruits and vegetables from a substantial garden, and maintained efficient systems for everything from laundry to bookkeeping. "Nathan modernizes where he can," Peter explained, showing Charlotte the pump that brought water directly into the kitchen sink. "He's practical above all else, sentimental about nothing except maybe his experimental wheat." Charlotte rarely saw Nathan during daylight hours. Despite the punishing heat, field operations continued without pause. Wheat needed tending, irrigation channels required constant monitoring, and the small crew of hands who lived in the bunkhouse required management. He returned each evening covered in dust, ate quickly, and retreated to his study, where Charlotte sometimes heard him moving about late into the night. On Peter's final evening, as Charlotte prepared to take full responsibility for the household, she finally asked the question that had been forming since her arrival. "He seems to live only for work. Is there nothing else that brings him joy?" Peter's hands stilled as he showed her how to operate the complex coffee percolator Nathan had ordered from Chicago. Nathan was different before, laughed easily, played fiddle on Saturday nights. Sarah could calm him with just a touch when work frustrated him. He resumed his demonstration. "Now the wheat comes closest, especially that new variety he's developed. The Agricultural College in Lincoln says it might revolutionize dry land farming if it succeeds." "How did he come to think of taking another wife after such a loss?" "He didn't. It was my idea." Peter closed the percolator carefully. "Mother's health is failing, and Nathan refused to leave the farm to accompany me east. I told him he needed someone to manage things here, someone competent and strong-willed enough to handle this place, and him." A small smile touched his lips. "When Matthew came back from town with stories of a mail-order bride too citified for Cedar Ridge's menfolk, I knew we'd found the right candidate." The morning of Peter's departure dawned, clear and hot, promising another scorching day. Matthew had the wagon ready early, packed with Peter's trunks and provisions for the journey to the train station in Omaha. "The letters are arranged by date," Peter said, handing Charlotte a small wooden box. "Write when you can. Mother enjoys news from the farm." "Take care of each other," Peter told his brother as they shook hands, his gaze moving meaningfully between Nathan and Charlotte. "And remember what I said about patience." As the wagon disappeared down the long drive, Charlotte felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on her shoulders. She was now effectively the mistress of the Broken Wheel, married or not, with a household to run and a wounded man's trust to justify. "I've work in the West Field," Nathan said, already turning toward the barn. "Dinner at noon." Left alone, Charlotte spent the morning familiarizing herself with the house. The pantry with its carefully preserved stores, the linen closet stacked with precisely folded bedding, the small library containing an eclectic collection of books that revealed more about Nathan Caldwell than he perhaps realized. Practical volumes on agriculture and farm management sat alongside. Well-worn poetry collections and dog-eared copies of scientific journals. A detailed atlas with notations in the margins suggested a mind that wandered far beyond the borders of his wheat fields, at least in thought. By midday, Charlotte had prepared a hearty meal and set the kitchen table. As she worked, she contemplated the strange turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been a respectable spinster in Boston, facing genteel poverty. Now she stood in a remote Nebraska farmhouse, preparing to become the wife of a man she barely knew, a man who carried visible and invisible reminders of heartbreaking loss. Nathan returned as the sun reached its zenith, washing at the outdoor pump before entering the kitchen. He hesitated almost imperceptibly at the threshold, as if struck by the sight of a woman who wasn't his wife moving about his domain. "Smells good," he offered, hanging his hat by the door. "Corn fritters and salt pork," Charlotte replied. "I found the recipe in the tin box." They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness Charlotte had anticipated failing to materialize. Nathan ate with appreciation rather than the distracted haste she'd observed on previous evenings. "You found the library," he noted, gesturing toward the books she'd left on a side table. "Yes, you have an interesting collection. The agricultural journals are particularly comprehensive. Sarah loved reading." He left the sentence unfinished, but after a moment added, "Feel free to use anything there." After the meal, instead of retreating to his fields as Charlotte expected, Nathan surprised her by motioning her to follow him outside. They walked in silence past the barn to a small rise overlooking the vast wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon. The grain rippled like a golden sea under the relentless sun, interspersed with sections of slightly different color and height. "This is why we're called Broken Wheel," Nathan said finally, indicating the patchwork pattern. "Each section is a different variety, some traditional, some experimental." His voice took on a different quality when he spoke of the wheat, a hint of the passion that Peter had mentioned. "The standard turkey red fails 1 year in 4 here due to drought. I'm developing strains that can survive with less water." Charlotte sensed this was more than idle conversation. It was Nathan's way of showing her what mattered to him, what drove him to continue after losing so much. "That's why the irrigation system is so complex," she observed. "You're controlling water access for each variety differently." Nathan looked at her with subtle surprise. "Most people don't notice that detail." "I notice systems," Charlotte replied. "Simply. It's what made me unsuitable in town, seeing inefficiencies where others saw tradition." Nathan studied her for a long moment, the furrow between his brows deepening in thought rather than disapproval. From his pocket, he withdrew a small cloth sack. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. "I thought you should have something to mark our arrangement, even before the official ceremony." Charlotte accepted the ring, unexpectedly touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful. It's practical," he corrected, though something in his tone suggested he was pleased by her response. "People respect a wedding band. Makes things simpler." As she slipped the ring onto her finger, Charlotte realized this was perhaps the most honest beginning to a marriage she could have hoped for. No false promises or romantic delusions, just two people facing reality together. "I should warn you," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm still the same woman who was too citified for Cedar Ridge. That won't change, even here." For the first time, Charlotte saw what might have been the ghost of a smile touch the corner of his mouth. "Miss Hayes, Charlotte, if I wanted a farm woman, I'd have sent for one. The broken wheel doesn't need gentle, it needs capable." The prairie wind whipped around them, bending the wheat into rolling waves of gold and amber. Despite the heat beating down from the relentless summer sky, Charlotte felt something unexpected begin to stir within her. Not hope, exactly, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that suited Charlotte's methodical nature. Mornings began before dawn, with the preparation of breakfast for Nathan and the farmhands. By the time the men trudged in from the bunkhouse, bringing with them the scent of dust and sweat, she had hot coffee, biscuits, and salt pork waiting. July deepened, bringing even more punishing heat. The creek that bordered the property slowed to a trickle, and the men spent long hours managing the precious water resources, diverting carefully measured amounts to each field, according to Nathan's exacting calculations. Charlotte adapted to farm life with the same determination that had carried her through previous challenges, tackling each new task as an intellectual puzzle rather than an insurmountable obstacle. She discovered an unexpected ally in Matthew Jenkins. The taciturn foreman began bringing her small offerings, a particularly fine chicken for Sunday dinner, wild berries he'd found while checking fences, honey from a settler 5 miles west who kept bees. In return, Charlotte made sure his favorite, Johnny cakes, appeared regularly on the breakfast table, and she mended his shirts with the fine stitching her mother had insisted she master, despite her preference for books over needlework. "Matthew says you've reorganized the storage cellar," Nathan remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, seeking relief from the stifling heat inside. These quiet hours after supper had become a wordless ritual, each occupied with their own tasks but sharing the space. Charlotte looked up from the ledger book she was updating. "I hope that's acceptable. Peter's system was perfectly functional, but I found a way to group items that might save steps." Nathan nodded, returning to the seed catalog balanced on his knee. "Your house, your decision." The simple phrase carried weight beyond its brevity. Your house, not Sarah's anymore, not even just his. In 3 words, Nathan had acknowledged her place and authority within the household. For a woman who had been rejected 3 times for overstepping bounds, the recognition was more valuable than any praise. As August approached, Charlotte had established herself firmly in the rhythms of the broken wheel. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent mornings tending the kitchen garden that now flourished with vegetables from Mrs. Wilson's seeds, and afternoons preserving the summer harvest for the coming winter. The ledgers that had been merely functional under Peter's care now reflected Charlotte's meticulous attention to detail. She had implemented a double-entry bookkeeping system that tracked every expense and yield with precision, creating a clear picture of the farm's operations that even Nathan, with his natural suspicion of change, had to acknowledge was superior. "You've saved us $8 this month," he noted one evening, reviewing her calculations. "How?" "By consolidating orders from the mercantile and negotiating better prices," Charlotte explained. "They charge less per unit for larger purchases, and the freight comes out the same." Nathan studied the neat columns of figures. "Most farmers' wives just keep a list of what's needed." "Most farmers' wives weren't bookkeepers," Charlotte replied simply. Something that might have been admiration flickered in Nathan's eyes before. He returned to the ledger. The drought that had gripped the region showed no signs of breaking. Each morning, Nathan studied the sky with increasing concern, though he said little. The hands spoke in hushed tones about farms to the south already failing, families packing their wagons and abandoning homesteads when their wells ran dry. The broken wheel fared better than most, thanks to Nathan's innovative irrigation system. and drought-resistant wheat varieties, but even these advantages had their limits. Charlotte overheard Nathan and Matthew discussing water rationing, diverting the remaining reserves to save only the most promising experimental fields while sacrificing others. That night, after the household had gone quiet, Charlotte found herself unable to sleep. The unrelenting heat made the upstairs rooms stifling despite open windows. She descended to the kitchen for a drink of water and was surprised to find a light still burning in Nathan's study. She hesitated, then knocked softly on the half-open door. Nathan sat at his desk, surrounded by maps and diagrams, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his collar open against the heat. He looked up, momentarily startled by her presence. "I saw the light," Charlotte explained. "Is everything all right?" Nathan gestured to the papers spread before him. "The creek's flow has dropped another 2 inches. At this rate, we'll lose half the crop within a week." His voice held no self-pity, merely a flat acknowledgement of facts. Charlotte stepped fully into the room, drawn by the challenge in his words. "May I?" she asked, indicating the maps. Nathan nodded, moving aside to make room as she studied the diagrams, detailed drawings of the irrigation channels that crisscrossed the farm, with notations about water levels and flow rates. Her father had taught her to read engineering plans when they did bookkeeping for a Boston construction firm, and she immediately grasped the elegance of Nathan's design. "You're diverting water equally to all fields," she observed, "even to the established varieties that need less." "It's the fair approach," Nathan replied. "Every field gets its share." Charlotte shook her head. "Not fair to the wheat that could survive with less. You're treating unequal needs equally." Nathan's brow furrowed. "What would you suggest?" "Triage," Charlotte said firmly. "Identify which fields absolutely must have full water to survive, which can manage with reduced flow, and which might survive on minimal rations. Then redistribute accordingly. Some fields would receive almost nothing. Better to save part of the crop than lose it all to fairness," Charlotte countered. "My father used to say a good bookkeeper knows when to write off a loss to save the business." Nathan studied her for a long moment, the lamplight casting deep shadows across his weathered face. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "we'll survey the fields together." The next morning found them riding out at dawn before the worst heat of the day descended. Charlotte wore a pair of Peter's old trousers beneath her skirt, allowing her to ride astride rather than side saddle, a practicality that raised Nathan's eyebrows but drew no comment. Field by field they assessed the wheat's condition, with Nathan explaining the requirements of each variety and its resistance to drought. Charlotte took careful notes, applying the systematic approach her father had taught her to this problem of survival. "This section here," Nathan indicated a field of particularly robust wheat, its stalks still green despite the parched earth. "This is my new crossbreed. First successful test plot after 3 years of failures." Charlotte noted the pride in his voice. "And its water needs?" "Less than most, but it's still young. A total loss now would mean starting over completely." By midday, they had visited every field and returned to the house to escape the punishing sun. At the kitchen table, Charlotte arranged her notes into a coherent plan, allocating the remaining water resources according to need and potential. "These southern fields get the least," she explained, indicating sections on the map. "They're already showing significant stress, and the varieties are widely available elsewhere if we need to replant next season." Nathan nodded, following her. "Logic. And the experimental sections? Priority access, but not excessive amounts. They've proven their hardiness. Let them demonstrate it further." Charlotte met his gaze directly. "This approach maximizes our chances of preserving what's most valuable without sentimental attachments to any particular field." For a moment, Nathan was silent, and Charlotte wondered if she had overstepped once again, offering unwanted advice. where a proper farm wife would have simply deferred to her husband's judgment. Then he nodded decisively. "We'll implement this tomorrow. I'll have Matthew redirect the channels according to your calculations." The simple acceptance of her plan, with no qualifications or condescension, affected Charlotte more deeply than she expected. Here, finally, was the respect she had sought, given freely on merit rather than grudgingly or not at all. The following days brought the water rationing plan to life as Nathan and the hands worked tirelessly to adjust the irrigation system. Fields were sacrificed according to Charlotte's triage, their once green stalks browning under the relentless sun. Other sections received just enough moisture to cling to life, while the most promising varieties were given the lion's share of the dwindling resource. A week into the new system, Nathan returned from his morning inspection with the first smile. Charlotte had seen cross his face. "The crossbreed is holding," he reported. "Better than I'd hoped. And the Turkish variety you identified as hardy is showing new growth despite minimal water." Charlotte felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. Together, they might save enough of the crop to sustain the farm through another year. As August gave way to September with still no rain, news reached them of neighboring farms abandoned, families giving up dreams of prosperity to retreat eastward or push further west. Matthew reported that half the farms within 20 miles had failed, their owners either leaving or seeking work with larger operations that had deeper wells. "Thomas Miller rode through yesterday," he told Nathan over breakfast. "Says the bank in Cedar Ridge is foreclosing on 6 properties this month alone. Edmund Clark's calling in loans early, claiming the drought makes them high risk." Charlotte looked up sharply at the mention of her former suitor. "Mr. Clark is foreclosing, even on farms that might recover with rain." Matthew nodded grimly. "Says he has to protect the bank's interests. Word is he's buying the land himself through a cousin, getting it for pennies on the dollar." "Vulture," Nathan muttered, the single word containing more emotion than Charlotte had heard from him in weeks. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching heat lightning flicker on the horizon, nature's cruel promise of rain that never came, Charlotte broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Is the broken wheel financed through the Cedar Ridge Bank?" Nathan's silence answered before his words did. "Partially. We have a loan that comes due next spring. And with the reduced crop yield." "We'll make it," Nathan said firmly. "The triage plan saved enough to cover the payment, even at current prices." Charlotte hesitated, then pressed forward. "Unless Clark calls in the loan early, as he's doing with others." The furrow between Nathan's brows deepened. "He has no grounds. We've never missed a payment." "He might not need grounds if he's determined to acquire more land," Charlotte pointed out. "From what I observed in town, Mr. Clark is not above using his position to personal advantage." Nathan's gaze sharpened. "You sound as if you know him well." "He was my 3rd rejected suitor," Charlotte admitted. "He found my opinions on territorial water rights too forward for public expression." Understanding dawned in Nathan's eyes. "And now he knows you're here. Which may make the broken wheel a particular target, yes." The implications hung between them in the still night air. If Clark held a grudge against Charlotte for his public embarrassment, or simply saw opportunity in the drought, the farm they had worked so hard to save might still be at risk from threats beyond their control. "We need alternatives," Nathan said finally. "Other buyers for the wheat, other sources of funds." Charlotte nodded, her mind already working on the problem. "The agricultural college in Lincoln that's been corresponding about your experimental varieties, might they have interest in purchasing seed directly?" "Possibly, though they typically work through established suppliers." "And the military?" "I've read that the forts west of here require substantial grain supplies." Nathan's expression shifted from concern to consideration. Fort McPherson contracts with Eastern Mills, but with rail prices rising, they might consider local sources. Tomorrow I'll draft letters, Charlotte decided. We'll explore every option. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to the Broken Wheel. Charlotte was in the kitchen preparing the midday meal when she heard the distinctive sound of a buggy approaching, a rarity in these parts, where most travelled by wagon or horseback. Through the window, she glimpsed a well-appointed black carriage turning into the farm's yard, a stark contrast to the weathered equipment that typically arrived. Nathan was in the fields with the hands, and Charlotte hesitated only, briefly before wiping her hands on her apron and stepping onto the porch. The visitor who descended from the buggy was all too familiar. Edmund Clark, dressed in a suit far too formal for the surroundings, his thin hair carefully arranged beneath an expensive hat. "Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted her with practiced courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "How unexpected to find you here. I'd heard rumors, of course, but scarcely credited them." "Mr. Clark," Charlotte acknowledged coolly. "This is a surprise. My husband is working in the fields at present. Actually, it's you I hope to speak with." Clark removed his hat, a gesture of politeness that somehow seemed calculating rather than respectful. "Might I trouble you for a moment of your time? And perhaps a glass of water. The journey has been the most dusty." Charlotte's instinct was to refuse, but curiosity overcame caution. She led him into the kitchen, where she poured water from the pitcher kept cool in the stone sink, but did not invite him to sit. "I'll come directly to the point," Clark said after drinking. "The drought has created unfortunate circumstances for many in our region. The bank has had to make difficult decisions to protect its investments." "So I've heard," Charlotte replied, neutrally, though some might question the timing of calling in loans just when farmers are most vulnerable. Clark's smile tightened. "Business is rarely sentimental, as you of all people should understand, given your background. But I'm actually here to offer assistance." "Assistance? The Broken Wheel is in a precarious position." "Oh, don't look surprised. I'm well aware of Mr. Caldwell's financial arrangements. The payment due next spring will be substantial, and with reduced yields." "We'll meet our obligations," Charlotte stated firmly. Clark set down his glass. "Perhaps, but why struggle unnecessarily? I'm prepared to offer a new arrangement, a private loan at favorable terms, secured against only a portion of the property, rather than the entire farm." Charlotte's suspicion deepened. "Why would you make such an offer?" "Let's call it atonement for our misunderstanding in town." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I recognize too late that your forward nature might be an asset in certain contexts. The Broken Wheel has potential beyond mere farming. With the right management and investment, it could become a cornerstone of regional agriculture." The implication was clear. Clark wasn't offering help. He was seeking control, using the drought as leverage to acquire what he couldn't otherwise obtain. "I appreciate your concern," Charlotte said carefully, "but any financial decisions would naturally be made jointly with my husband. When Nathan returns, I'll be sure to—" The kitchen door opened abruptly as Nathan himself entered, his expression darkening at the sight of their visitor. He'd clearly ridden hard from the fields, alerted to the unexpected arrival by one of the hands. "Clark," he acknowledged tersely, "you're a long way from your counting house." "Mr. Caldwell, I was just explaining to your wife that the bank is reviewing all its agricultural loans in light of the drought. Standard procedure, you understand." Nathan moved to stand beside Charlotte, the gesture subtly protective. "Our arrangement is clear. Payment is due in the spring, not before." Of course. Clark replaced his hat with deliberate precision. But conditions change, markets shift. It seemed only neighborly to discuss options before circumstances become pressing. "Our circumstances are our concern," Nathan replied. If the bank has formal communication, you can send it through proper channels. The banker's affable mask slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of something harder beneath. As you wish, though I should mention that the directors have approved a general review of all loans exceeding $500. Foreclosure notices will be issued where appropriate by month's end. After Clark's departure, the tension in Nathan's shoulders remained visible as he paced the kitchen. He's looking for land grabs, using the drought to force sales at panic prices. Charlotte nodded, her mind racing through possibilities. He's particularly interested in the broken wheel. I suspect his offer of a private loan was merely the first step toward gaining control of your experimental wheat. Nathan stopped pacing, his gaze sharpening. What exactly did he propose? A new loan against a portion of the property, presumably the fields containing your crossbreed varieties. He mentioned the potential beyond mere farming, quite specifically. Understanding dawned in Nathan's expression. The seed rights. That's what he's after. He ran a hand through his dust-streaked hair. The agricultural college believes the drought-resistant strain could transform farming across the territories. If Clark controls the seed source, he controls the market, Charlotte finished, a far more valuable asset than a few hundred acres of Nebraska farmland. Nathan's face hardened with resolve. We have 3 weeks before the bank could reasonably issue a foreclosure notice. We need to secure alternate financing before then. Charlotte reached for the ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer. I've been corresponding with the quartermaster at Fort McPherson. They've expressed interest in a direct contract for next season's wheat, with a possible advance payment. How far along are these negotiations? Nathan asked, surprise evident in his tone. They've requested samples and pricing terms, Charlotte replied, opening the ledger to reveal copies of the correspondence. I took the liberty of pursuing the connection after our discussion last week. Nathan studied the letters, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his gaze. A new awareness as he regarded the woman who had entered his home as a convenient solution to a practical problem, and had instead become an essential ally in its survival. You didn't mention this. I didn't want to raise hopes prematurely, Charlotte explained. Military bureaucracy moves slowly, and there was no guarantee of interest. Nathan shook his head slowly, a hint of what might have been admiration warming his usually guarded features. Edmund Clark has no idea what he's up against, does he? For the first time since arriving at the broken wheel, Charlotte felt the corners of her mouth lift in a genuine smile. He rejected me for having opinions on territorial water rights. He's about to discover I have opinions on a great many other matters as well. The next morning found Charlotte and Nathan at the kitchen table before dawn, papers spread between them as they formulated their strategy. The lamp's golden glow cast long shadows as they worked, their heads bent together over letters and ledgers. Fort McPherson needs a decision within 2 weeks, Charlotte noted, tapping the quartermaster's correspondence. They're willing to advance 1/3 of the payment once the contract is signed, but they require 800 bushels by spring. Nathan ran calculations in his head. We can manage 600 from current yields, even with the drought losses. The remaining 200, he frowned, considering options. We'd need to purchase from elsewhere to fulfill the order, which defeats the purpose of securing advance funds, Charlotte concluded. Unless, she reached for the farm journal, where Nathan meticulously recorded yields from each field, flipping to the sections detailing his experimental wheat. Your crossbreed produces nearly 20% more grain per acre than standard varieties. If we dedicated more acreage to it next planting, it remains untested at scale, Nathan cautioned. One successful test plot doesn't guarantee consistent results across multiple fields. Charlotte studied his face in the lamplight, noting the conflict in his expression. You don't fully trust your own creation. "I trust it enough to risk my fields," he replied, "not enough to risk the farm's survival." This was the cautious farmer speaking, the man who had learned through bitter experience that hope often withered as quickly as wheat in drought. Yet Charlotte had seen the pride in his eyes when he showed her the experimental plot. The careful notations in his journals documenting every stage of development. "What if we proposed a modified contract?" she suggested. 600 bushels of standard wheat, delivered immediately after harvest, with the option for Fort McPherson to purchase the crossbreed separately as a premium product once it's proven. Nathan considered this, the furrow between his brows, deepening in thought rather than rejection. The military values reliability over innovation. They might not see the advantage. Then we need to show them, Charlotte decided. Not just tell them about your wheat, but demonstrate its value. A plan began forming in her mind, drawing on her years of watching her father negotiate with Boston's merchants. "We need to visit Fort McPherson in person, bring samples of both varieties, and make our case directly to the quartermaster." Nathan shook his head. "Harvest begins in 3 days. I can't leave the farm now." "After the initial cutting, then," Charlotte pressed. "Matthew and the hands can manage for 2 days while we travel to the fort. It's our best chance to secure the advance payment before Clark makes his move." The journey to Fort McPherson, 4 days later, marked Charlotte's first significant trip since arriving at the Broken Wheel. They traveled in the farm's best wagon, carefully packed with samples of both wheat varieties and documentation of yields and milling qualities. The 2-day journey took them through parched landscapes where other farms had already failed, abandoned homesteads standing as stark reminders of the drought's toll. Charlotte observed Nathan's reaction as they passed these silent testaments to broken dreams. His face remained impassive, but his hands tightened on the reins, knuckles whitening. The Broken Wheel might have been among them, if not for his foresight with irrigation and water management. "You anticipated this drought," she said, not a question but a realization. Nathan nodded slightly. 3 years ago, after Sarah and Emma. He rarely spoke their names, and the effort was visible. "I needed something to focus on besides grief. Started studying weather patterns, soil conditions. The signs were there for those willing to see them. That's why you developed the crossbreed. You weren't just improving wheat, you were preparing for disaster." "Survival isn't accidental," Nathan replied simply. "Not for wheat, not for farms, not for people." It was perhaps the most revealing statement he had made about himself, offering Charlotte a glimpse of the man beneath the weather-beaten exterior. Someone who had faced devastation and chosen to build systematic defenses against future loss. Rather than surrender to fate, Fort McPherson rose from the prairie like an island of organization amid nature's chaos. The military outpost housed 3 cavalry companies and served as a supply depot for smaller installations throughout the territory. Its wooden buildings, arranged in precise formation around a central parade ground, represented federal authority in a region where government often seemed a distant concept. Captain Thomas Wilson, the fort's quartermaster, received them in his office with the brisk efficiency of a man perpetually behind schedule. He was younger than Charlotte had expected from his letters, perhaps only in his early 30s, with the ramrod posture of a career officer and intelligent eyes that assessed them quickly. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," he acknowledged, gesturing to chairs across from his desk. "Your correspondence arrived at an opportune time. Our usual supplier from Kansas has suffered significant crop failures this season." Charlotte allowed Nathan to lead the initial discussion, watching as he outlined the Broken Wheel's production capabilities with the quiet authority of a man who knew his land and its capabilities intimately. He spoke without embellishment or exaggeration, presenting facts with the same precision he applied to his experimental breeding. When he introduced the subject of the crossbreed variety, however, Charlotte noted the quartermaster's attention beginning to wander. To military procurement, innovation represented uncertainty, and uncertainty represented risk. "Captain Wilson," she interjected smoothly, "you mentioned in your letter that flour quality has been inconsistent from your current suppliers." Wilson refocused on her with mild surprise. "Indeed. The commissary officers report significant variation in baking performance, particularly in field conditions." Charlotte reached into the satchel they had brought, producing 2 small canvas bags. "We've taken the liberty of milling samples of both our standard wheat and Mr. Caldwell's specialized variety. If your kitchen could prepare basic biscuits from each, I believe the difference would become immediately apparent. The demonstration proved more effective than hours of technical explanation." By mid-afternoon, they sat at Wilson's table, sampling biscuits made from both flours. The difference was unmistakable. The crossbreed produced a flour that remained consistent in baking, even with minimal leavening, a critical advantage for military field kitchens. "The men would certainly appreciate better bread," Wilson acknowledged, reaching for a third biscuit made from the experimental flour, "and the storage qualities you describe would reduce waste significantly. We can supply 600 bushels of standard wheat immediately after harvest," Charlotte proposed, "with an additional 200 bushels of the premium variety available by late fall, subject to your approval after testing." Wilson leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from professional interest to genuine consideration. "And you're requesting an advance on a portion of the payment?" "1/3, Nathan specified, "to secure necessary equipment for proper harvesting and storage." It wasn't the entire truth. The advance would primarily serve to protect them from Clark's machinations, but it wasn't a lie either. Without proper equipment, they could indeed lose a portion of the harvest to spoilage or inefficient processing. "I'll need authorization from Fort Leavenworth for the advance," Wilson said finally, "but I'm prepared to sign a provisional contract today, pending that approval." As they departed the fort the following morning, contract in hand, Charlotte felt a cautious optimism she hadn't experienced since arriving in Nebraska. The agreement promised not only financial security, but validation of Nathan's years of careful experimentation. If the crossbreed performed as expected, the military contract could lead to broader recognition and potentially transform the Broken Wheel from a struggling farm into a source of innovation for the entire region. "You were right about demonstrating rather than explaining," Nathan admitted as their wagon rolled across the prairie toward home. "My father always said farmers talk too much about crops and not enough about results." "My father said much the same about bookkeepers," Charlotte replied, smiling slightly at the memory. "Figures tell a story, but people remember examples." They traveled in companionable silence for several miles before Nathan spoke again. "I owe you an apology." Charlotte looked at him in surprise. "Whatever for?" "I brought you to the Broken Wheel as a housekeeper," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I didn't consider what else you might bring." The simple acknowledgement meant more than flowery praise might have from another man. Nathan Caldwell did not offer words lightly, and his recognition of her value beyond domestic duties represented a significant shift in their relationship. "We haven't secured the advance yet," Charlotte reminded him, unwilling to claim victory prematurely. "We have a strategy," Nathan countered, "more than I had before you reorganized my water distribution and found a military customer." Their return to the farm coincided with the beginning of harvest, any further conversation postponed by the demands of bringing in the wheat crop. The hands worked from dawn until dusk, cutting, binding, and threshing as quickly as possible to avoid losses from potential storms. Nathan moved between fields like a general directing troops, making decisions about which sections to harvest, first based on ripeness and weather forecasts. Charlotte found herself drafted into service beyond the kitchen, recording yields from each field and organizing the storage of grain according to variety and quality. The experimental wheat performed even better than Nathan had predicted, producing plump kernels with excellent milling characteristics despite the drought conditions. Mason rode in from town, Matthew reported one evening, as the exhausted harvest crew gathered for supper. Says the bank posted foreclosure notices on the Peterson and Williams places yesterday. Nathan's expression darkened. Both were in better shape than most. Their loans weren't due until winter. Clark's making his move earlier than expected, Charlotte noted. Has there been any word from Fort McPherson? Matthew shook his head. No mail rider for 3 days. That night, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Charlotte found Nathan on the porch, staring at the distant horizon where heat lightning flickered against the darkening sky. We need a contingency plan, she said without preamble. If the military advance doesn't arrive before Clark acts. Nathan nodded, his profile sharp against the intermittent flashes of light. I've been thinking the same. We have options, but none without risk. He outlined possibilities, selling off equipment they could replace later, approaching larger operations for short-term loans, even mortgaging the experimental fields to a seed company that might recognize their value. Each alternative came with significant drawbacks, potentially compromising the farm's long-term viability to ensure its short-term survival. There's another possibility, Charlotte said carefully, one we haven't discussed. Nathan turned to face her, waiting. My father's a former business partner in Boston, she continued. Before his business failed, they had a falling out over modernization. My father favoring traditional methods, Mr. Atwood pushing for new approaches. When our business collapsed, Atwood offered to buy the client list, but pride prevented my father from selling. You still have connections there? Charlotte nodded. I corresponded with Mr. Atwood before leaving Boston. He expressed interest in financing new ventures, particularly those involving innovative approaches to established industries. The furrow between Nathan's brows deepened. You're suggesting we seek Eastern investment in the wheat crossbreed? As a last resort, Charlotte clarified. Atwood would drive a hard bargain, demand partial ownership of the seed rights, but he wouldn't be interested in controlling the farm itself, unlike Clark, who wants both. Nathan was silent for a long moment, weighing options with the same careful consideration he gave to every aspect of farming. When he finally spoke, his voice held a new note, not resignation, but determined pragmatism. Draft a letter tomorrow. We'll hold it in reserve while we wait for word from the fort. The following days brought a flurry of activity as harvest continued, and Charlotte composed a carefully worded proposal to Atwood and Company of Boston, outlining the potential of Nathan's drought-resistant wheat and suggesting terms for investment that would protect the Broken Wheel's interests while offering substantial returns to Eastern capital. The letter remained unsealed on Nathan's desk, a contingency neither wished to employ, but both recognized might become necessary. Each day they watched the road for the mail rider, who might bring word from Fort McPherson, and each evening the horizon remained empty. A week after their return from the fort, Charlotte was in the kitchen garden when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Not the steady rhythm of the mail rider's horse, but the more urgent pace of someone pushing their mount hard. She straightened, shading her eyes against the setting sun, to see Matthew galloping toward the house, dust rising behind him like a signal flag. Nathan emerged from the barn, striding to meet his foreman as the horse skidded to a halt in the yard. Clark's men are at the northern property line, Matthew reported, the words carrying clearly to where Charlotte stood. 4 riders, marking boundaries like they're surveying. Nathan's posture stiffened. They have no right to be on Broken Wheeland. They're claiming the creek bed is county property, Matthew continued. Said they're assessing water rights for all adjoining farms under bank lien. Charlotte hurried to join them. wiping garden soil from her hands. "It's a pretext," she said. "Clark's establishing grounds to claim our water access is improperly documented, giving him leverage to accelerate foreclosure." Nathan's face hardened into lines of resolution. "Saddle my horse," he instructed Matthew, "and bring the property deeds from my desk, the southeast drawer, leather portfolio." As Matthew rushed to comply, Nathan turned to Charlotte. "This isn't just about money anymore. Clark's making this personal." "It was always personal," Charlotte replied, "from the moment he learned I was here." Nathan studied her face, seeming to reach a decision. "Send the letter to Boston," he said. "Today. We can't wait for the military any longer?" Charlotte nodded, understanding the significance of his choice. Nathan Caldwell, who had built the broken wheel through solitary determination, was accepting outside help, not just from her, but potentially from unknown Eastern investors, to save what he had created. "And while Matthew takes the letter to town," Nathan continued, his voice taking on a new edge of determination, "you and I are going to remind Edmund Clark exactly where the boundaries of the broken wheel lie." The northern property line ran along a shallow creek that had dwindled to little more than a trickle in the prolonged drought. As Charlotte and Nathan approached on horseback, the sun, low on the horizon, cast long shadows across the parched landscape. 4 men were visible near the creek bed, driving stakes into the ground and stretching measuring lines between them. Charlotte recognized Clark himself, supervising the activity, his suit incongruous against the rugged surroundings. He looked up at their approach, his expression shifting from surprise to calculated pleasantness. "Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted them with forced cordiality. "We're simply conducting a routine survey of water access points. Nothing to concern yourselves with." "You're trespassing," Nathan stated flatly. "This is private property, clearly marked." Clark's smile remained fixed. "The county has authorized a comprehensive assessment of watershed rights in response to the drought emergency. Purely administrative, I assure you." "The county has issued no such authorization," Charlotte countered, recognizing the fabrication. "From her knowledge of territorial law, water rights were established in the original land patents and can only be modified through formal proceedings." Clark's gaze hardened as it shifted to her. "Mrs. Caldwell, these are complex matters of territorial regulation that I studied extensively while in Boston," Charlotte interrupted. "The Nebraska Territory Water Compact of 1862 specifically prohibits reassessment of established claims without petition from all affected parties." It was a calculated risk. Charlotte had indeed studied territorial law before her journey west, but she was extending her knowledge with a confidence that might exceed her actual expertise. However, the effect on Clark was immediate. His smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a thinly veiled contempt. "Your city education hardly qualifies you to interpret territorial statutes," he said dismissively. "The bank has a responsibility to protect its investments by ensuring proper water access." Nathan urged his horse forward, placing himself between Charlotte and Clark. "You have until sundown to remove your men and equipment from my land," he stated, his quiet voice carrying more authority than shouting might have. "Any stakes or markers left behind will be considered abandoned property," Clark signaled to his men, who stopped their measurements but made no move to depart. "I had hoped to handle this amicably," he said, his tone shifting to open threat. "But since you insist on difficulty, you should know that the bank's directors have authorized immediate action on all delinquent accounts." "Our account is not delinquent," Charlotte stated. "An unfortunate clerical error has been discovered," Clark replied smoothly. "It seems your May payment was improperly credited. As of tomorrow, the broken wheel loan will be formally in default." The fabrication was transparent, a manufactured excuse to accelerate foreclosure proceedings. Nathan's hands tightened on his reins, his knuckles white with suppressed anger. "That's fraud," Charlotte said flatly. "It's banking," Clark corrected with a thin smile. "Documents can be so easily misplaced in times of crisis. You have 3 days to bring your account current with all accumulated interest, or foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately." The ride back to the farmhouse passed in tense silence, both Charlotte and Nathan consumed by the gravity of Clark's threat. 3 days to produce funds they didn't have, or lose everything, not just the farm itself, but the years of painstaking work, developing wheat that could withstand the harsh prairie conditions. "He's bluffing about the paperwork," Charlotte said as they dismounted in the yard. "No judge would uphold such an obvious fabrication." "Judges don't reach Cedar Ridge often," Nathan replied grimly. "By the time a circuit court could hear them case, Clark would have already seized the property." Inside they found Matthew waiting with the leather portfolio of property deeds. "Letters on its way to Boston," he reported. "Paid extra for the express pouch on the eastbound train." Even with the fastest reply, Atwood couldn't respond in 3 days, Charlotte calculated. "Not from Boston." Nathan spread the deeds on the kitchen table, studying the carefully drawn property lines and water rights documentation. Clark's counting on legal confusion to justify his actions. "But these papers are in order. My father made certain of that when he first claimed this land. Then we need to make sure others see them before Clark can act," Charlotte decided. "The county recorder in Lincoln should have copies, but we should also establish public awareness of our legal standing." A plan began forming between them. Nathan would ride to Lincoln the next morning with the original deeds, ensuring they were properly verified and recorded with territorial authorities. Charlotte would draft notices establishing their clear title to both land and water rights, to be posted in Cedar Ridge and neighboring communities. "That addresses the legal challenge," Nathan acknowledged, "but not the financial one. Clark can still demand immediate payment regardless of the property documentation." Charlotte paced the kitchen, her mind racing through possibilities. "The military contract advance is our best hope, but we can't count on it arriving in time. We need to mobilize other resources." By lamplight, they conducted a thorough inventory of every potential asset on the farm, equipment that could be sold, grain that could be leveraged, even personal items of value. The calculations were disheartening. Even liquidating everything, not essential to basic operations, would raise less than half the amount needed to clear the loan. "There's one other possibility," Charlotte said reluctantly as midnight approached. "My mother's jewelry. Before coming west, I placed it in a security box at First National Bank in Omaha. It's not substantial, a few modest pieces with more sentimental than monetary value, but combined with everything else." Nathan shook his head firmly. "Those are your personal possessions, your family legacy. I won't have you sacrificing that for the farm." "It's not just your farm anymore," Charlotte replied quietly. "You made that clear when you gave me your mother's ring." The simple statement hung in the air between them, acknowledging the evolution of their arrangement from one of convenience to genuine partnership. What had begun as a practical solution to their respective problems had become something neither had anticipated, a shared purpose that transcended their initial agreement. Nathan's expression softened in the lamplight. "We'll consider it only as a last resort," he conceded. "First, let's see what response we get from Lincoln and Fort McPherson." The next morning brought a flurry of activity as they implemented their strategy. Nathan departed for Lincoln before dawn, carrying the original property deeds and a letter Charlotte had drafted to the Territorial Land Commissioner explaining their situation. Matthew was dispatched to neighboring farms to alert them to Clark's water rights maneuver, which threatened not just the broken wheel, but potentially all properties along the watershed. Charlotte remained at the farm to coordinate operations and prepare the public notices establishing their legal claims. As she worked at the kitchen table, drafting language that would stand up to scrutiny, she heard the approach of yet another rider. Through the window, she glimpsed a military uniform, a courier from Fort McPherson. Hope surged as she hurried to meet him. The young corporal dismounted, touching his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Caldwell, dispatches from Captain Wilson." The sealed envelope contained not the anticipated contract approval, but a brief message explaining that Fort Leavenworth had requested additional documentation before authorizing the advance payment. Captain Wilson remained supportive of their arrangement, but was bound by military procurement regulations that required multiple approvals for non-standard contracts. "The captain expects a response within 2 weeks. The courier explained, "but wanted you to know there's strong interest in Mr. Caldwell's specialized wheat variety. 2 weeks, far too long to address their immediate crisis." Charlotte thanked. The courier provided him with water for his return journey and returned to the kitchen, disappointment settling heavily in her chest. The military option had been their most promising avenue, and now it had narrowed to a distant possibility. That would come too late to save them from Clark's machinations. By mid-afternoon, with notifications prepared for posting in Cedar Ridge, Charlotte made a decision. She would ride to town herself, not just to deliver the notices, but to confront Clark directly at the bank. Perhaps she could negotiate a short extension, enough time for either the military contract or Atwood's response to materialize. The drought had rendered the usually dusty road to Cedar Ridge into a hardened track, allowing for faster travel than she had experienced on her previous journeys. Charlotte rode with determination, her Boston riding lessons proving useful as she pushed the horse to a steady canter. The town appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent, the buildings shimmering in the late afternoon heat. Cedar Ridge had changed little in the months since Charlotte had departed after her third rejection. The mercantile, the church, the boarding house and the bank still defined the main street, though several smaller businesses appeared shuttered, casualties of the economic hardship brought by the drought. As she tied her horse at the hitching post outside the bank, Charlotte caught sight of her reflection in the glass window. Gone was the prim Boston bookkeeper who had arrived months earlier in her proper traveling dress. In her place stood a woman in a practical riding skirt, her face tanned from garden work, her hair simply arranged beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She looked like what she had become, a farmer's wife shaped by the prairie's demands, yet she carried with her the same determination and intelligence that had made her unsuitable for the town's menfolk. Those qualities, rejected then, had become her greatest assets at the Broken Wheel. With that thought bolstering her confidence, Charlotte entered the bank. The interior was cooler than the street outside, its heavy curtains and solid furniture, designed to convey permanence and security. A young clerk looked up from his ledger, recognition and surprise crossing his face as he identified her. "Mrs. Caldwell," he acknowledged with awkward formality. "How unexpected." "I need to speak with Mr. Clark," Charlotte stated, her tone brooking no argument. "Mr. Clark is in a meeting and cannot be disturbed," the clerk replied, seeming uncomfortable. Under her steady gaze, "Perhaps you could return tomorrow. This matter concerns imminent bank action against the Broken Wheel Farm and cannot wait until tomorrow," Charlotte countered. "Please inform Mr. Clark that I'm prepared to discuss terms that might be mutually beneficial." The calculated phrasing had its intended effect. The clerk hesitated, then rose and disappeared through a door behind the counter. Moments later, Edmund Clark emerged, his initial expression of annoyance quickly masked by professional cordiality. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is a surprise. I was under the impression your husband was handling your financial matters." "Mr. Caldwell, "And I manage our affairs jointly," Charlotte replied evenly. "I understand you've discovered a supposed discrepancy in our loan documentation." Clark gestured toward his private office. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter away from the public area." Inside the well-appointed office, with its leather chairs and imposing desk, Clark assumed the advantage of his position, seating himself behind the desk while indicating a smaller chair for Charlotte. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Caldwell," he began, once the door was closed. "The bank's position is quite clear. The loan payment record shows an irregularity that places your account in technical default. However," he spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness, "I'm authorized to offer accommodation in the form of refinancing." "What terms?" Charlotte asked, though she already anticipated his answer. "The existing loan would be retired and replaced with a new arrangement secured specifically against the northern sections of your property, the areas containing Mr. Caldwell's experimental wheat fields. Interest would be slightly higher, reflecting the increased risk of agricultural lending in the current climate." It was precisely as they had suspected. Clark wasn't interested in foreclosure itself, but in gaining control of Nathan's drought-resistant wheat. The technical default was merely leverage to force them into surrendering the very innovation that could transform farming across the territory. "That's a generous offer," Charlotte replied, matching his tone of false reasonableness. "However, we've recently entered into negotiations with both military procurement at Fort McPherson and Eastern investors regarding the commercial development of the crossbreed variety." A flicker of surprise crossed Clark's face before he could suppress it. "I find that difficult to credit. The military's purchasing procedures are notoriously slow, and Eastern capital rarely ventures into speculative agricultural enterprises." Charlotte removed Captain Wilson's letter from her reticule, sliding it across the desk. "The military's interest is quite real, as you can see, and as for Eastern investment," she allowed a small smile, "Boston firms take a keen interest in innovations that address persistent market challenges. Drought-resistant wheat represents precisely such an opportunity." Clark scanned the letter, his expression hardening as he confirmed the military's interest was genuine. "This is merely a request for additional documentation, not a contract," he noted, pushing the paper back toward her. "And I see no evidence of Eastern investment." "Both avenues are proceeding satisfactorily," Charlotte stated with more confidence than she felt, "which is why we're prepared to offer you an alternative proposition." She outlined a counter-proposal, a 30-day extension on their loan terms, during which time either the military contract or Eastern investment would provide funds to clear the existing obligation in full. In exchange, the bank would receive a modest fee for the accommodation, along with preferred status for financing future expansion of the Broken Wheels operations. "An interesting suggestion," Clark said when she had finished, "but ultimately inadequate. The bank requires immediate resolution of the default, not promises of future payment. Even if those promises are secured by contracts with the federal government or established Boston firms," Charlotte challenged. "Even then," Clark's mask of cordiality slipped further. "Business is business, Mrs. Caldwell. The drought has created extraordinary circumstances requiring decisive action." Charlotte studied him, seeing beyond the banker's facade to the man beneath, someone who had rejected her for being too knowledgeable, too willing to express her opinions, and was now facing those same qualities deployed against his interests. "This isn't about business," she said quietly. "This is personal. You didn't want a wife who would challenge you intellectually, and now you resent that I found a place where my abilities are valued rather than suppressed." Clark's expression hardened into something ugly. "What I want, Mrs. Caldwell, is the innovative wheat strain your husband has developed. The broken wheel itself is incidental, a means to an end. Had you been more accommodating during our courtship, perhaps different arrangements could have been reached. The naked admission of his motives confirmed everything they had suspected. Clark wasn't acting on behalf of the bank's interests, but pursuing personal advantage through institutional means. 3 days, he continued, rising to indicate the meeting was concluded. Bring full payment to retire the loan, or foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately. Good day, Mrs. Caldwell. Charlotte departed the bank with a mixture of anger and determination. Clark's intransigence had eliminated any possibility of negotiation, but his frank admission of personal motives rather than business concerns gave her an idea. If he was abusing his position at the bank for private gain, perhaps the bank's directors might take interest in that fact. Her next stop was the Cedar Ridge Gazette, a modest weekly newspaper operated by Howard Jenkins, a former Chicago journalist, who had moved west for his wife's health. Charlotte had met him briefly during her time with Edmund, finding him refreshingly direct and unimpressed by the town's social hierarchies. The Gazette's office was little more than a front room with a printing press and a desk overflowing with papers. Jenkins looked up from setting type as she entered, recognition dawning slowly. Miss Hayes? No, Mrs. Caldwell now, if the gossip's accurate. It is, Charlotte confirmed, and I have information that might interest a newspaper concerned with the public good. Jenkins gestured to a chair beside his desk. Those are increasingly rare commodities, both information and the public good. What's your story? Charlotte outlined the situation concisely. Clark's manufactured loan discrepancy, his attempt to seize the experimental wheat fields, and most significantly, his admission that he was acting for personal benefit rather than legitimate banking concerns. You're suggesting a prominent citizen is abusing his position to acquire valuable agricultural innovations, Jenkins summarized when she had finished. That's a serious allegation. One I'm prepared to substantiate, Charlotte replied. The Broken Wheel's loan payments are fully documented. The water rights are legally established in territorial records, and Mr. Clark's interest in the experimental wheat can be confirmed by multiple witnesses. Jenkins considered this, tapping a pencil against his desk. A story questioning the bank's foreclosure practices during the drought would certainly sell papers, but it would also make powerful enemies. Powerful enough to suppress legitimate news? Charlotte challenged. A slow smile spread across the editor's face. I didn't leave Chicago to practice timid journalism, Mrs. Caldwell, but a story needs more than allegations. It needs context, human interest, a narrative people can connect with. What if that narrative included how Cedar Ridge rejected a mail-order bride for being too educated and outspoken, only to have her help develop agricultural innovations that could save farms across the territory? Charlotte suggested. Jenkins leaned forward, interest kindling in his eyes. Now that's a story worth telling. The city woman using her book learning to save the very community that found her unsuitable, with the rejected suitor trying to steal what she helped create. By the time Charlotte departed the Gazette office, Jenkins had committed to a special edition addressing both the broader pattern of questionable foreclosures throughout the region and the specific targeting of the Broken Wheel's innovative wheat breeding program. The bank's directors in Omaha may take interest in how their local branch is being operated, he noted as she left, particularly if their managers' actions generate unfavorable publicity during an economic crisis. Charlotte's final stop in Cedar Ridge was the telegraph office, where she composed 2 messages. One to Captain Wilson at Fort McPherson, emphasizing the urgent nature of their situation and requesting expedited consideration of their contract, and another to her father's former partner in Boston, summarizing the crisis and asking whether any response to their detailed letter might be possible within the week. The sun was setting as she began the ride back to the Broken Wheel, casting long shadows across the drought-parched landscape. Despite the day's discouraging confrontation with Clark, Charlotte felt a growing determination. They still had options: Nathan securing the property documentation in Lincoln, the pending military contract, potential Eastern investment, and now the possibility of public pressure through the Gazette's reporting. As the farm appeared on the horizon, she saw another rider approaching from the opposite direction, Nathan returning from Lincoln. They met at the entrance to the property, both dusty and tired from their respective journeys. "The deeds are properly recorded," Nathan reported without preamble. "The land commissioner confirmed our water rights are established under the original territorial grant. Clark has no legal grounds to challenge them." "That's something," Charlotte replied, though he made it clear today that legal justification is secondary to his determination to acquire your wheat varieties. As they rode side by side toward the house, Charlotte shared the results of her confrontation with Clark and her subsequent actions with the newspaper and telegraph office. Nathan listened without interruption, the furrow between his brows deepening as he absorbed the implications. "You've accomplished more in one day than most could in a week," he observed as they reached the barn, using city ways that folk here were too narrow-minded to value. The simple acknowledgement warmed Charlotte more than elaborate praise might have. Coming from Nathan Caldwell, a man of few words and careful judgments, it represented a profound recognition of her worth. As they tended to their horses, working together with the easy coordination that had developed between them over the months, Charlotte considered how far they had come from their initial arrangement of convenience. What had begun as a practical solution to their respective problems had evolved into a genuine partnership, one that now faced its greatest test. "We have 2 days left before Clark's deadline," Nathan said as they walked toward the house together. 2 days to find a solution or lose everything." "Not everything," Charlotte corrected quietly. "Whatever happens with the farm, what we've built between us remains." Nathan stopped at the porch steps, turning to face her in the gathering twilight. For a moment, the customary reserve in his expression fell away, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. "When Sarah and Emma died," he said, his voice rough with rarely expressed emotion, "I thought I'd lost the only things that mattered. The farm became just land and crops, a way to keep moving forward when standing still meant drowning in grief." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "I brought you here to manage a household. I didn't expect you to make it a home again." In that moment, as shadows lengthened across the yard and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Charlotte Hayes Caldwell understood that regardless of what the next 2 days might bring, she had finally found what she had sought all along, not just respect for her abilities, but recognition of her true value by someone who saw her clearly for exactly who she was. Dawn broke on the first of their final 2 days with a sky the color of hammered copper, beautiful but offering no promise of rain. Charlotte and Nathan rose early, moving through their morning routines with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that every moment counted. Over breakfast, they refined their strategy. Matthew would ride to Fort McPherson with samples of the latest wheat harvest, hoping to expedite the military's decision process. Charlotte would draft a formal complaint to the Territorial Banking Commission regarding Clark's conflict of interest. In targeting their farm, Nathan would continue harvest operations while preparing documentation of the crossbreed wheat's performance for potential investors. "We fight on every front," Nathan stated, his voice carrying the calm determination that had sustained him through personal tragedy and agricultural challenges alike. Legal, financial, and practical. As they prepared to implement their plan, the sound of an approaching wagon drew them to the porch. A cloud of dust marked its progress along the road, moving at a speed that suggested urgency rather than the measured pace of routine travel. "That's Howard Jenkins's rig," Nathan identified the vehicle as it drew closer. "The newspaper editor." Charlotte felt a surge of hope. He must have information about Clark. The wagon rattled into the yard, Jenkins handling the reins with the competence of a man accustomed to covering long distances quickly. Beside him sat a distinguished-looking gentleman in a suit that, despite the dust of travel, still carried the unmistakable quality of Eastern tailoring. "Mrs. Caldwell," Jenkins called as he brought the horses to a halt. "Found this gentleman at the Cedar Ridge station asking directions to the Broken Wheel. Thought I'd save him from local misdirection." The passenger descended with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to wagon travel, brushing dust from his sleeves before extending his hand to Charlotte. "William Atwood, of Atwood and Company, Boston," he introduced himself. "I believe you've been corresponding with my firm regarding an agricultural investment opportunity." Charlotte's surprise must have shown on her face, for Atwood smiled slightly. "Your telegram indicated urgency. The train is a remarkable convenience for those with pressing business." Nathan stepped forward, introducing himself with the direct manner that characterized all his interactions. "You've come a long way on speculation, Mr. Atwood." "Calculated risk, Mr. Caldwell," Atwood corrected pleasantly. "Your wife's letter described a potentially revolutionary advancement in drought-resistant wheat. Given the recurring cycles of prairie drought and the national importance of grain production, such an innovation merits immediate investigation." Inside, over coffee that Charlotte hastily prepared, Atwood revealed that he had departed Boston immediately upon receiving their detailed letter, the telegram merely confirming what he was already en route to investigate. "Agricultural innovation is becoming a primary focus for the Eastern capital," he explained, "particularly adaptations to challenging environments. The expanding frontier requires scientific approaches to cultivation, not just determination and hard work." Jenkins, who had accepted Charlotte's invitation to stay, leaned forward with journalistic interest. "A rather different perspective than our local financial institutions seem to hold. The Cedar Ridge Bank appears more interested in acquiring and foreclosed properties than supporting agricultural development. A short-sighted approach," Atwood commented, "though common enough among local bankers with limited vision." The conversation shifted to the specifics of Nathan's wheat breeding program. With growing animation, Nathan outlined the years of systematic experimentation that had led to his drought-resistant variety, the careful selection of traits for both hardiness and milling quality, and the documented performance during the current crisis. Atwood listened with keen attention, asking questions that revealed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of agricultural science for a Boston financier. When Nathan concluded his explanation, Atwood set down his coffee cup decisively. "I'd like to see these wheat fields myself, Mr. Caldwell, particularly the experimental varieties." The inspection tour that followed transformed the Broken Wheel from a farm under siege to a showcase of innovation. Nathan guided Atwood through the various fields, explaining the irrigation system that had helped them survive the drought, and demonstrating the superior performance of his crossbreed wheat compared to standard varieties. Charlotte observed the growing interest in Atwood's expression as he examined seed heads, tested kernel hardness between his fingers, and made notes in a small, leather-bound book. His questions became increasingly specific about yield ratios, disease resistance, and potential scalability of production. Most farmers would have abandoned these methods after the first season of failure, Atwood noted as they examined the specialized equipment Nathan had modified for handling the unique characteristics of his wheat. "What made you persist?" Nathan's answer was characteristically straightforward. "Survival isn't accidental. The prairie doesn't reward those who quit at the first setback." By midday, as they returned to the house for a meal Charlotte had prepared, during their tour, Atwood's initial professional interest had transformed into evident enthusiasm. "Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Caldwell," he addressed them both equally as they settled at the kitchen table, "I came prepared to evaluate a potential investment. What I've found exceeds my expectations considerably. He outlined his proposal without preamble. Atwood and Company would provide immediate capital to clear the bank loan and fund expanded production of the drought-resistant wheat. In exchange, they would receive a 20% interest in commercial seed sales while leaving farm operations entirely under Caldwell management. This differs substantially from typical investment structures, Atwood acknowledged. Usually, Eastern capital seeks controlling interest, but agricultural innovation requires the ongoing expertise of those who developed it, not just financial oversight. The terms were more favorable than anything Charlotte and Nathan had dared hope for, sufficient funding to resolve their immediate crisis while preserving their autonomy and future opportunities. After a brief private consultation, they accepted Atwood's offer with a handshake that bridged the divide between Eastern capital and Western innovation. Jenkins, who had listened to the negotiations with journalistic interest, cleared his throat. As the agreement was concluded, this development puts a rather different complexion on tomorrow's Gazette edition. Instead of reporting on questionable bank foreclosures, perhaps I should focus on how Eastern investment is recognizing prairie innovation that local institutions failed to support. I suspect that angle might generate considerable public interest. Atwood agreed with a small smile, particularly among the bank's directors in Omaha. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity as formal agreements were drafted, combining Charlotte's bookkeeping precision with Atwood's financial expertise. By evening, they had created a framework that protected all parties' interests while establishing clear timelines for implementation. As dusk approached, Jenkins prepared to depart for Cedar Ridge, promising to adjust his newspaper coverage to reflect the new developments. "Clark won't take this quietly," he warned as he climbed into his wagon. "Men like that don't surrender advantages easily, even when outmaneuvered." Atwood, who had accepted their invitation to stay overnight rather than risk the journey back to town in darkness, nodded in agreement. "I've encountered his type in Boston financial circles. Pride often overrides prudence when challenged publicly." The warning proved prescient. Shortly after Jenkins's departure, as Charlotte was preparing the evening meal, Matthew galloped into the yard with news from town. "Clark's gathered men at the saloon," he reported breathlessly, "talking about serving foreclosure papers tonight instead of waiting until the deadline. Says he has legal authority to seize the property immediately due to asset deterioration during drought conditions. He's moving before Atwood's investment becomes official," Charlotte realized immediately. Nathan's expression hardened into lines of resolution. "How many men?" "6 or 7, including 2 from the bank, armed, from what I could see." Atwood, who had joined them on the porch, pursed his lips thoughtfully. "A rather extreme approach for what should be a routine financial transaction. Almost suggests awareness that the legal grounds might not withstand proper scrutiny." "It suggests Clark knows he's about to lose," Charlotte stated flatly. "He's gambling that possession, once established, will be difficult to challenge even with proper documentation." Nathan turned to Matthew. "Gather the hands, not to fight. I won't risk anyone over property, but to witness. Make sure everyone understands that." As Matthew hurried toward the bunkhouse, Nathan outlined his plan. They would not resist Clark's men physically, which might provide legal justification for escalation. Instead, they would ensure that multiple witnesses observed any improper actions, creating testimony that could later be used in territorial court. "A sound approach," Atwood agreed. "Though perhaps we might add another element to your strategy." The Eastern banker's suggestion was both simple and potentially decisive: immediate execution of their investment agreement, with funds transferred to the Cedar Ridge Bank the following morning. While Clark and his men were engaged in theatrical Foreclosure efforts at the farm, Atwood's representative in Omaha would wire funds to retire the loan entirely, effectively nullifying any legal grounds for seizure. The timing creates a fascinating legal question, Atwood noted, with the calm interest of someone discussing an abstract puzzle rather than an imminent threat. Can a bank foreclose on a property whose loan is in the process of being paid in full? A question certain to interest regulatory authorities. As darkness settled over the prairie, Charlotte, Nathan, and Atwood completed the final documentation for their agreement, signing in triplicate with the farmhands serving as witnesses. Nathan then deployed the men strategically around the property, with instructions to observe and remember, but not engage. "Whatever happens tonight," he told Charlotte as they waited on the porch, watching the distant road for approaching riders, "the broken wheel continues. If not here, then elsewhere. What we've built isn't just land and structures." Charlotte understood his meaning completely. The partnership they had formed, the innovations they had protected, the trust they had established, these were not bound to physical property, but existed in the connection between them. "I came west seeking security," she reflected, watching the first stars appear above the darkened plains. "I thought that meant a husband, a household, a place to belong. I never imagined it would mean this, fighting for something we created." Together, Nathan's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that communicated more than words could express. The simple touch contained everything that had evolved between them: respect that had deepened into admiration, partnership that had grown into affection, and a shared purpose that had emerged from their initially practical arrangement. The distant thunder of hoofbeats announced the approach of Clark's party well before they became visible. Charlotte felt Nathan tense beside her, though his expression remained resolute rather than fearful. Atwood calmly reviewed documents by lamplight, seemingly unconcerned by the impending confrontation. Clark and his men rode into the yard with unnecessary drama, dust billowing around stomping hooves as they formed a semicircle before the porch. The banker himself carried a sheaf of papers, his expression a mixture of triumph and poorly concealed anger. "Caldwell," he called, not bothering to dismount. "I have here an emergency foreclosure order authorized by the Cedar Ridge Bank due to material deterioration of secured property during drought conditions. You are hereby notified that this property now belongs to the bank and must be vacated immediately." Nathan stepped forward, his posture straight and his voice steady. "I see no judge's signature on those papers, Clark. Emergency foreclosure requires judicial approval, not just bank authorization." "These proceedings are fully compliant with territorial banking regulations," Clark retorted, though Charlotte noted a flicker of uncertainty cross his face as he registered the calm confidence with which Nathan challenged him. "Are they indeed?" Atwood emerged from the shadows of the porch, his Boston suit and authoritative bearing creating an unexpected presence in the confrontation. "As a banking professional with some familiarity with territorial regulations, I would be most interested to review the specific provisions you're invoking." Clark's expression shifted from confidence to wariness. "Who exactly are you?" "William Atwood, of Atwood and Company, Boston. Currently engaged in investment negotiations with Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell regarding their innovative agricultural operations." Atwood's tone was pleasantly conversational, but carried underlying authority. "I'm particularly interested in the legal basis for foreclosure proceedings initiated less than 24 hours before a scheduled loan payment that would resolve any outstanding obligations." The revelation visibly unsettled Clark, whose gaze darted between Atwood, Nathan, and Charlotte as he reassessed the situation. What he had expected to be a simple intimidation of isolated farmers had transformed into a confrontation with Eastern financial interests. "The bank's decision is final," Clark insisted, though with diminished conviction. "The foreclosure papers have been filed with the county recorder." "How fascinating," Atwood replied mildly. "Since I dispatched my associate to that very office this afternoon to register our investment agreement, which specifically addresses loan resolution, I wonder which filing will be processed first." Charlotte stepped forward, unable to contain herself further. "What Mr. Atwood is too polite to say directly, Mr. Clark, is that you're engaged in a transparent attempt to seize valuable agricultural innovations through abuse of your banking position, an action that the Territorial Banking Commission and your directors in Omaha might find worthy of investigation." The men behind Clark shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other with growing unease. What had seemed a straightforward bank action was revealing itself as something more problematic, potentially tainted with impropriety that could have consequences beyond this single farm. "The drought has created extraordinary circumstances," Clark attempted, his earlier bravado fading. "The bank must protect its investments through decisive action." "Indeed it must," Atwood agreed pleasantly, "which is why my firm has arranged for wire transfer of funds sufficient to retire the Caldwell loan in full, to be received by your bank at opening tomorrow. A fact that renders tonight's theatrics not only unnecessary but potentially actionable if pursued further." The standoff stretched into tense silence, broken only by the stamping of horses and the distant call of night birds. Clark's men looked increasingly uncertain, while the banker himself seemed caught between rage and calculation as he assessed his deteriorating position. Finally, with visible effort, Clark regained his composure. "If payment is indeed received tomorrow, the bank will naturally accept it as satisfaction of the loan. Until then, the foreclosure notice stands as a matter of record." "As does our investment agreement," Atwood countered smoothly, creating a rather interesting legal question regarding priority of documentation, one that would necessarily involve detailed examination of all parties' actions leading to this moment. The implied threat of scrutiny that would reveal Clark's personal motives and questionable methods hung in the night air. With a curt nod that conceded nothing while retreating from everything, Clark reined his horse around. "The bank will expect payment in full by noon tomorrow," he stated, a final attempt to maintain authority. "Any delay will result in immediate enforcement of the foreclosure order." As Clark and his men rode away, their departure considerably less dramatic than their arrival, Charlotte felt the tension drain from her body. Nathan's arms slipped around her shoulders, steadying her as the adrenaline of confrontation faded. "It appears our strategy has bought us the time needed," Atwood observed, watching the dust cloud disappear into the darkness. "Though I suspect Mr. Clark will create whatever difficulties he can manage within the constraints of his increasingly precarious position." The following morning brought both resolution and new beginnings. True to his word, Atwood dispatched confirmation of funds transfer to the Cedar Ridge Bank, with copies to the Territorial Banking Commission and the Omaha directors. By noon, they received official acknowledgement that the Broken Wheel loan had been satisfied in full, with no outstanding obligations to the bank. Just as significant was the arrival of a military courier from Fort McPherson, bearing news that Captain Wilson had received authorization for their contract, including the advance payment they had initially requested. The timing, while no longer critical for loan resolution, represented validation of Charlotte's business strategy and Nathan's agricultural innovation. "Two paths to salvation," Atwood noted with satisfaction as they reviewed both communications. Over lunch, each arriving independently but confirming the fundamental value of what you've created here. The afternoon edition of the Cedar Ridge Gazette arrived with Matthew's return from town, its headline bold across the front page. "Easton Investment recognizes local innovation. Boston firm partners with Broken Wheel Farm on drought-resistant wheat. Howard Jenkins's article detailed the partnership between Atwood and Company and the Caldwells, emphasizing the national significance of agricultural adaptations to prairie conditions. In a particularly pointed paragraph, he noted, while local, financial institutions focused on foreclosure during drought conditions, Eastern Capital recognized the long-term value of innovations developed by forward-thinking Nebraska farmers. A smaller article on the same page reported that Edmund Clark had been summoned to Omaha by the bank's directors for consultation regarding lending practices during the current agricultural crisis. The implication was clear. Clark's attempts to acquire the Broken Wheel had backfired completely, likely ending his career in territorial banking. As evening approached, bringing the conclusion to their 3-day crisis, Atwood prepared to depart for Cedar Ridge, where he would catch the eastbound train back to Boston. His firm would manage the commercial development of Nathan's wheat through their agricultural division, with regular reports and profit distributions to follow. "You've created something remarkable here," the Boston banker told them as he bid farewell. "Not just the wheat itself, but the partnership that protected and developed it. Our agreement reflects that reality, equal shares, equal voices in future decisions." After Atwood's departure, Charlotte and Nathan stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the wheat fields in shades of gold and amber. The drought continued unbroken, the sky clear of rain clouds, yet the immediate threat to their future had been resolved through their combined strengths. "I never imagined a city woman would save a prairie farm," Nathan said quietly, his gaze on the horizon, but his awareness centered on the woman beside him. "That Boston bookkeeping would matter more than knowing how to churn butter or sew quilts." Charlotte smiled at the observation. "And I never imagined a Nebraska farmer would value a woman's mind above her domestic skills. That being too educated and too opinionated would become assets rather than liabilities." As darkness settled over the Broken Wheel, Charlotte Hayes Caldwell reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The mail-order bride rejected for her city ways had found not just acceptance, but appreciation in the most unexpected place, beside a grizzled farmer who recognized that true worth transcended conventional expectations. Together, they had faced drought, financial threats, and personal confrontation, drawing on complementary strengths to overcome challenges neither could have managed alone. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had evolved into a partnership of equals, founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. The experimental wheat field stretched before them, visible in the moonlight as a testament to innovation born from necessity. Like those carefully cultivated plants, their relationship had taken root in harsh conditions, growing stronger through adversity rather than despite it. As Nathan's hand found hers in the darkness, Charlotte realized that she had not only found her place in this vast, challenging landscape, but had helped transform it through the very qualities that had once made her unsuitable as a frontier wife. Her city ways, her education, her forthright manner, her systematic approach to problems had proven precisely what the Broken Wheel needed to survive and flourish. And in recognizing her true worth, Nathan Caldwell had revealed his own capacity for growth and adaptation, qualities as vital to human survival on the frontier as drought resistance was to prairie wheat. Together, they had created something neither had imagined possible, a partnership that combined the best of Eastern knowledge with Western resilience, transforming both in the process. Spring would come eventually, bringing new challenges and opportunities, but whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced the crisis just ended, together, each complementing the other's strengths, creating something stronger and more valuable than either could have achieved alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.